So earlier, we continue with this conversation as we talk about now having a national dialogue. Wanjiru, you said you mentioned something. We are at in a constitutional moment.
Yes.
President Uhuru Kenyatta said this 2 years ago, and you vehemently said no.
Yes.
Why are you saying yes today?
And I am proud to have been part of the landmark court case that stopped the BBI project, which was an elite project to capture our constitution. Constitutions are living documents. And as they are implemented, you will inevitably find what fits and what doesn't fit. There are a number of things that we have seen don't fit in our constitution. That is what you call a constitutional moment. And so constitutions are expected to be reviewed as the implementation goes on. Now, the thing with BBI is it sought to emasculate and to bastardize the constitution because it was trying to create amendments to favor a few that undermined the foundational principles of the constitution. You will see if this dialogue continues without civic societies, without civic society voice, without critical media voice in it, the same thing is going to happen. Because politicians will be politicians, they must look after their interests. But yeah, there are things that don't work. We look at the implementation of devolution has become a rubber stamp process. Most of the resources are still being held by the national government. We need to address that. We have talked about Senate oversight. Now, the Senate says give us funds to oversight county governments. That's nonsense. They just want their own CDF kitty so that they can eat it, because that's what has been happening with the CDF kitty, which should be aligned to the Constitution. But the senators are not well connected to the oversight role of county governments. We missed something there. I believe our presidential system isn't working for us necessarily. We need to go back and have that discussion. There's the 2/3 gender rule, of course, which is one of the big ones. There is progressive realization that is being abused to deny people of their fundamental socioeconomic rights. So there are all these discussions that need to happen so that we can make the needed adjustments.
So now you agree that there's no basic structure to this constitution?
I did not say that.
If you're changing some of those things, like, our presidential system is not working, I don't know what. Are you not touching on
the fundamentals?
The cause?
If you are going to touch on those fundamental structures,
devolution.
The process, well, if you're talking about devolution and increasing the percentage, that doesn't address basic structure.
What does it address?
It addresses, it's still strengthening devolution. It is still a constitutional process. You still have to go through what the court said. They said, one, if you're doing a fundamental if you're revising the constitution fundamentally, you have to go back to the CKRC, which is a national dialogue.
In your argument in court, Wanjiru,
yes,
against the BBI and against, tinkering with the basic foundation of the constitution, what was it that you thought was particularly tinkering with that basic structure?
One, there was the issue of separation of powers. And by the way, my getting involved, at the point at which I got involved, even foundationally, the BBI process was flawed because the rationale used and the framing of the 8 questions or 9 questions, whatever they were, ignored the reality. Because they started from the premise that the political leadership of Raila Odinga, Uhuru Kenyatta have come together and agreed to assist the country, ignoring the electoral malpractice of 2017. So they had ignored a whole load of realities. But when it got to the court, of course, basic structure doctrine was one of our key points, that you must respect separation of powers. You must respect the distinctness of county governments. You must respect, those foundational, foundational values and principles, the pillars of the Constitution. If we get into a national dialogue, and we find that there are some aspects of our governance that really don't serve us, then the process, and the court spoke to this, the process of changing those means you have to go back to a citizen-led a constitution review process, which entails the civic education, which entails the dialogue, which entails having those views then collated and framed, and the questions that then need to be structured, put in a way that is very clear and easy to understand. If it is just adjusting some of the, tweaking some of the provisions, then you use the sections of the Constitution that call for a referendum and the like. But the key thing is, at all times, active, informed, and structured citizen engagement is anticipated. This is a people's constitution.
Okay. The threat now, just like you've said, is having a BBI 2.0 in the name of these bipartisan talks. Because when you begin the bipartisan talks that look at addressing the issue of the formation of not just this IEBC, but also future IEBCs, like the president said, what is it that they'll be discussing? They may actually cross over into looking at create an office of the official leader of the opposition, the memorandum that the president had sent to Parliament. So there's a possibility of this actually expanding into discussing even what the president had sent to Parliament, into looking at what areas that need to be amended. Raila, just before the last rally, he had also introduced the issue of we need to relook at BBI. So he will come with BBI to the table and say, okay, there are some issues that we have discussed in the BBI. For example, let's create the position of a prime minister and 4 deputies. It's important for national cohesion so that we don't have this kind of thing happening in future elections. So there's a likelihood of a BBI 2.0 being born out of this. Where do we safeguard the voice and the interest of the citizens in that?
I'll still go back to the 2 points. Civic societies need to come together and work out, their common interest to safeguard the country. We need, and the second point is, we need an audit of the 13 years, because through the BBI process, civil society took more of a stance of resisting the process rather than speaking into the process in a structured way. It's high time we had a structured, of course, we need to engage in the process, but we need to now inform and say, so what have we gained? What is working in our electoral process? Dating back, and I think it's important for us to go back to the National Accord, not to start with what happened last year. That's not good enough, because things happened in 2017, things happened in 2013, and elections are not just voting day and the announcing of results. It has to do with the conduct of political parties. It has to do with, of course, the IEBC and how it's constituted. It has to do with the election laws, which have been tinkered with, and the provisions and recommendations of the Kriegler report diluted. It has to do with leadership and integrity, chapter 6. So civic societies
have to come together. Who has got to lead? If you look at the civic societies now, the 90s leading into the constitution, you had from the NCCK, the Reverend Dr. Mutava Musiemi. You had from the other side, Dr. Okio Okombaka. Coming together, Ufungamano, you had the likes of Professor Kivutha Kibwana, you had the likes of Professor Makao Mutua and the former Chief Justice, Dr. Willie Mutunga. You had the likes of them, and they just needed a few of them to lead and others coalesced around them. Now, Wanjiru, you are in that position now. Eh? In those days of your youth, you are looking at them. It is you now. Who among you is taking the mantles of leadership and saying we need to come together as civil society and start this conversation? Start our own parallel, like we saw with the parallel Ufungamano Constitution draft. Start your own parallel conversation.
There are a lot of conversations taking place. There have also been efforts by civil society in 2013, in 2017, and even now to coalesce these voices. There's the Kenya to Itakayo movement that has been active. We had Kenya Nisisi, a short-lived kind of formation that then morphed into the Kenya to Itakayo. So we had MOPA, which is the Movement for Openness and Political Accountability. Civil society has been trying to coalesce these voices. And so discussions have been taking place. And even if you look at what happened in the 90s, you have to keep trying to bring people together. It is fractious. There are interests. One formation gives birth to another. The issue is, will we put in the time, the pressure? Do we have the clarity to do this political political work? So yes, conversations are taking place. Do I see it forming? Do I see something forming? I think I do. Raila Odinga has inadvertently triggered a realization that the country is not as stable as we like to think, that it is not just the cost of living, but we also are very politically fragile. So the events of the last 3 weeks have shown leaders in civil society, in the religious, that we need to revisit this discussion. It cannot be business as usual. It has to, we have to get into that high level political discussion around our country and what we want the Kenyan state to look like.
Practically, we have this, we talk about, having the citizenry, having the people involved in their governance, participatory governance. We talk about it. I mean, it's almost like a buzzword. Yeah. But the truth is, when you ask the question, what would it look like? What would be satisfactory levels where you say, yes, we have people who are involved in processes, who are concerned and then leading onto action about what their own governance looks like, the Switzerland of this world or the Nordic countries that we so often refer to. What would that look like actually? To say that now you have 40 odd million people who kind of go around their business, and there's this clamor to say, you must be involved. It must be you who essentially dictates how this country will be ruled. These folks are in a position of service. How would it look like? What would happen that we would then say, yes, we've gotten to the point where at least this is happening? What does that look like?
I think it is happening. I think I'll just, just reiterate once again. Civil societies, associations are organizing, are engaging their leadership, whether they're engaging in terms of taxation, in terms of levies that are being, placed on them, whether it's local residents working with their MCAs or their administrators. Citizens are engaging, because if you go back to the 90s and where citizens were and where we are today, we are engaging more. But there is a gap, and I agree with you, and this gap has to do possibly with the fact that after the Constitution was passed, after the citizen-led Constitution was enacted, we dropped the citizen. We dropped the civic education. The political leaders then ran away with our new constitution.
We allowed them to run away.
Because for me,
we relaxed.
What it looks like,
and thought we've reached.
For me, what it looks like is that you have a good part of Kenyans, whatever country that we're looking at, aware. Because the person who coined the phrase that knowledge is power knew what they were talking about. It is power for you who has the knowledge. It is also a release of power for the person who is in power over you when they realize that you know. So for me, it looks like any decision that will be made by a partisan committee today, working party tomorrow, that they will not think twice without involving you. That the people will be front and center of their decision. Because of the fact that we talk about countries where a road is not built without the input of the people. Laws are not changed. The first thing is they think, wait a minute, we've not consulted the people, we have to ask them. And all of that is born from people having an innate knowledge, are engaging every day with this governance. And for me, that's what it looks like. For me, that's what it looks like, that nobody's making a decision without involving you. There's no way you're having a committee without bringing in a representative for the people. No way.
You see, what happens is the lie that Wanjiru said, I had mentioned, and repeat that lie again. So that it's, so,
You're not
so
gonna
that
let
it's
it go,
clear.
are you?
You want to use a whole platform to misinform Kenyans?
Well, I'm actually just joining you. You decided on the misinformation. I'm just carrying along that same line. You see, the fundamental difference between civil society and the politicians is this. Civil society looks at issues that actually need addressing, issues that are important, that are germane. Then they talk among themselves and decide how this thing works. They do some consultation. Politicians, especially the ones who are really supreme, they actually know what the people need and want. So their conversations are crafted around what people want. Then they stand in front of the problem and they lead the problem. The assumption is that they lead people. No. They've understood what people want. When somebody has the people with them, it doesn't matter how good your agenda is, you're going to lose to them. Even when it comes to now what we like referring to as misleading or taking people away from the real issues. Once the people are with them, the people will continue going with them. I'm repeating it. Civil society had people with them in the 90s. That's why they could make the impact. Right now, they don't. It's like a small club of people who talk about really very important things, but in a way that only people who understand what they're talking about do. If it goes to court, they'll get to hear about it. But getting this so-called people behind them, the truth is they don't.
Yes, I agree with you, and that's not necessarily a sign, a reason to give up. Because one, I agree, politicians have the people behind them. And as you were speaking, I thought about actually the Kenya Kwanza campaign strategy, which picked issues that were pertinent to the people. So did Azimio, for that matter.
For the longest time. It's the
So
same
issues were framed by media, framed by civil society, cost of living, also the issue about of an unfair economic system. So civil society contributed to the framing, media contributed to the framing of issues. Politicians very astutely picked these issues and turned them into a political campaign, and Kenya Kwanza then out-messaged Azimio, because they essentially picked the same things, slight differences here and there. So I would put it to you that, in a way, the ground has shifted, because people have been made promises, and they are watching for those promises. So much as we might think it was just Azimio supporters who are out on the street. I'm sure Kenya Kwanza supporters, if not on the street, were saying, yes, these guys better demonstrate, because we were told the cost of living would come down. Yes, in 30 days or something. And life is getting much more and more difficult. So the Kenyan voter has also shifted. Now, the problem is, without a values-based governance system, what is this voter shifting towards? They're shifting towards anarchy. Because you're saying that...
No, not necessarily.
No, well, if we don't have the value system, and if our political leaders can violate the law by inciting violence, by getting involved in theft of public funds, and then you're appointed to public office, if we are messaging that impunity pays, and if the posturing of our political leaders is impune, then that is what citizens will pick up. So the citizen, I think, will not, and I agree with you, will not tolerate broken promises. I think the genie's out of that bag. This is not a passive population that are going to sit by and let their political leaders craft a constitution. If they feel they are not being heard, then it might not be Raila Odinga leading the protest. And I think the fear here is the anarchy that seemed, to bubble through when looting began. So these are peaceful protests, but you can see there is a sense where it could easily run out of control.
Spiral out of control.
Yes, spiral out of control. So
the threat here is that once this political leadership coalesce and then they go and lock themselves up in a room and they start mutilating the constitution and coming out to the public and saying, you know what, we had to discuss this because see the country was heading in the wrong direction, and for the sake of peace and stability and posterity of the country, we had to come up with this document. They will corral the public into, first of all, accepting it, expecting it to be a solution. And by the time then the public realizes that, wait a minute, we've been duped once again, it'll be a couple of years down the road, wasted opportunities.
I don't know why you're
For me,
making
the
those
fear
assumptions.
is, what assumptions?
That
they're going to
the
mutilate the
public will be
Constitution.
corralled, that the public will pass. Because the main thing
Right
is, will
now-
it be a fair process? Because if it is a fair process, remember, government has twice lost a referendum on constitution change in this country.
You think this government is going to take people to a referendum?
Well, you
This
have to.
particular
If you're
government.
making changes to the
So
constitution,
let's say this,
you're going to
Wanjiru.
need
Let's,
to.
and that's exactly my point. If now the political leadership come together and they come out and say, all of them, Banan, coming out of the room and saying, we've actually, white smoke, we've agreed, right? One of the things that's going to happen is that they will be leading in this messaging, just like we have that messaging today, that because the president spoke on Sunday afternoon and Raila spoke on Sunday evening, there was a general sigh of relief that finally they are seeing eye to eye. We are now going into a conversation, and there's that general feeling of, okay, at least we're heading somewhere.
That's
If-
an assumption.
Yes,
It's a
No,
fair,
you-
it's
you-
a
no,
fair
no, no,
assumption.
no, no,
It's an assumption,
You
yes.
do not know the people who are on the street and those who
have
supported
not-
the demonstrations,
Yes.
because of cost of living realities,
Yes.
may be sitting there looking and asking, Raila better not betray us
What
again.
is your assumption based on?
No,
Yes.
because
My assumption is based on
that's a
observation.
reality of our history.
Yeah, my
so
my
not
assumption is also-
not everybody has heaved a sigh of relief.
Not
There are
everybody,
those who are
Wanjiru.
looking.
My assumption,
that simple.
Your assumption and my assumption are the same. You're assuming, I'm assuming. My assumption is based on observation. What happened yesterday? Did people go onto the street? Only a few people led by
Had they
Eric
been
Omondi went on the
dissatisfied,
streets.
would we have seen them going on the streets?
That's a question.
That's the
We
thing.
don't know that.
So the
We don't know
assumption
that.
here is that they have sat back and given them the credit and the benefit of the doubt,
Giving them a space.
and given them the space to have the conversation. If they misuse this space, they could go and misuse their space and come out and say, you know what, like you've been showing you, we're actually having a conversation. Yes, we've agreed this is the best way forward. A couple of months, a couple of years down the road, wasted opportunity to actually have the true conversation. That's my point. That if that citizen who's sitting back and is thinking, no, I've got to be involved in this process, if that citizen does not raise their voice now, it's a wasted opportunity. Now, your side of the assumption that it's not everybody who is satisfied, I agree.
Okay.
Those that are not satisfied, where are they?
Yes, that's the question. I don't think, my reading of the situation is Raila had an opportunity in 2017 when we had, of course, questionable election results. And he mobilized the country and was at a point, the country was at a breaking point, but it was at a critical point. And he then shook hands. And when he shook hands, he did not frame the issues for the public. The question is, one, will the issues be properly framed for the Raila supporting, you're talking about half of the voting population. Because the other half, we can assume, is in UDA Kenya Kwanza. So will the issues be framed? Then when the dialogue takes place, will they be true to the needs of Kenyans? But the point I was making is, the political interest aside, is this citizen is not in the same place they were even in 2017. So there are things we can't predict about what this citizen will do. The cost of living has never been higher. There are some interesting things happening with this administration where they are talking about progressive taxation. The tax measures they are imposing on the professional, middle class, the upper deckers, as David D derisively likes to call us, are not being imposed in the same way on the citizens. Will that take effect? Will it become a situation where the impact of the cost of living is less burdensome to the majority, and really then the middle class are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the exemptions being given to the business sector and the corporate sector and the social security support, which we support, being given to the lower level? If that happens, then you could have high cost of living, but the impact bearing more on middle class incomes. That changes the dynamic. So I think maybe the other interesting thing happening.
And for me, I think even as we continue to have, the time is not later, you know, for as we see things and the way they've progressed, the time is now. Kenya also being in a really unique spot whereby you don't have a shutdown in the voice of the people like you do in very many other countries. So time is to take advantage of the position that Kenya is uniquely placed in, to actually have a voice and to actually see things done as a result of that voice. You talk about state capture quite a lot, Wanjiru. Is it a surmountable thing in your opinion? Because it also always seems to be an ingredient in this thing that suppresses the voice of people.
Right. I think that's such a good question. And there's a very good article that was written by a young political analyst, Joe Kobudi, who's the curator of The Elephant.
Yes.
Who's a really profound thinker. And the article is about the two publics. And it speaks to some of the issues we've raised here about why do Kenyans vote in these leaders and then complain about them, because we'll die for these leaders. One, we will ask we'll ask them to buy us off. We sell our vote, we vote for them. Then the moment they get into office, we complain about them, and we spend 5 years complaining. And he talks about, the two publics, that Kenyans, because of the colonial experience, the kind of trauma, social and political trauma we have two publics. We have our private persona, where we engage in our chama, we engage in our PTA, the Residents Association, our private spaces with integrity and leadership, and we expect integrity and leadership. But when it comes into the public space, dealing with public resources, the moment you've gotten onto a committee that manages public money, you're expected to benefit your community and therefore steal public resources. And he talks about, this colonial frame, and others would call it a colonial mentality, as still being part of what rules us. And he says this colonial frame reinvents itself. So much as we had the colonialists, and then we had our own government, we are still in a colonial frame, because our political leaders get into office, intend to make back
what they spent
getting there, and paying what is now called the black tax, because you have to support your community, and your community expects you to do that. They expect you to create appointments, make sure people are employed. They don't ask, what is the procedure of employment? And if you haven't gotten your community employed until there's a bloated workforce that the Kenyan taxpayer pays money for, then you're not a good political leader. So there's a misalignment. So how do we deal with this colonial frame where political leaders must benefit themselves? The dynasty of Uhuru Kenyatta, got into the milk sector, for instance, and they did what they did, passed regulation, weakened the sector so that they were actually monopolizing the sector to put their own company at the center of this. And this is documented. And they went into several sectors with the same kind of mindset. And this is what we call the dynasty. And that's what you've heard William Ruto and the Kenya Kwanza proponents talking about, getting rid of the dynasty, irrespective of the fact that many of the politicians in Kenya Kwanza were in Jubilee and were part of building this dynasty. Now that they are there, what are we seeing? So the question we should be asking is, are they going to dismantle the dynasty? We've seen some actions against, some of the financial decisions that have been made against some of the companies that would impact the former First Family interests. Is that dismantling the dynasty? Or is dismantling the dynasty about accountability in the economic system? So what it looks like is they now want to create an oligarchy, because it can't be a dynasty. There is no historical wealth to protect. You have to make the wealth. And right now that wealth is held by the state. So if you privatize public institutions which own large trunks of land, which are in very privileged sectors such as energy. We've seen recent contracts being awarded. An independent power producer was a production contract was awarded to Gideon Moy's family. How was that done? Was that above board? What are the terms of that? Was that a competitive process? Is that the only family or interest company that could have taken that contract? So what we are now seeing is
how does one company become family, though, Wanjiru?
No. The point I'm making is you have to be politically connected. An oligarchy means that a few politically connected people benefit from the privatization process because public services are increasingly being delivered through partnerships with private companies.
Why does it sound to me like state capture?
Well, it's maybe in the semantics.
It's another
the
way.
principle is the same.
It's the same principle.
It is still a state capture,
State capture.
from a dynasty to an oligarchy. It's now not one family benefiting. It's now going to be a lot more people benefiting, like what we saw in Russia. The main thing is you still muzzle citizen voice. Citizens will still then not get the best value. You undermine democracy because you are actually violating the state contract. And it is still bad governance because you have to offend the constitution to do it.
There is a reality here that we sometimes miss in our conversation, and that is whether it's an oligarchy, whether it's a dynastic system, there's always a support system with it. The dynasty you talk, it's not one family, it's many families, it's many people. It's just that it's a club. It's always a club. It's a group of people. With an oligarchy, it's a group of people. The only thing is, it's a new group of people.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So the question that Ndu asked is this process going to dismantle the state capture?
That capture.
And we are saying no, it's not. Kenya Kwanza has made promises, but no, they are not going to dismantle state capture. They are replacing the actors in state capture so they can capture themselves.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.